Are Dr. Harris and Dr. Vicky joining for this one too?
Okay, so Dr. Vicky should be. We just had a faculty meeting, and then my streaming, something happened with my streaming. Just a moment. But Dr. Harris is defecting over to Dr. Sumner's sessions. We're gaining Dr. Nelson.
Cool.
And now we are live on the World Wide Web. I like that, Cooper. Thank you. Cole is just joining us. Maybe Dr. Nelson can pretend to be Dr. Harris. Yeah, I know. I think Dr. Harris, Dr. Sumner stole him away is what actually happened. She sent a group email saying, Dr. Harris, can you please join my presentation? So I almost like threw myself in front of that bus as it was leaving this person, but I figured I'd be diplomatic. So this is Dr. Campbell's capstone presentations from our Violence and Terror class for all of those who are joining us live. We will have some professors joining us shortly. We have 4 great presentations under the collective heading of anti-colonialism and its effects. And so starting off for us right now will be none other than Armel TeTe. And so Armel, if you can pull up your presentation, I will give you the floor. All right, you're close, Armel.
Okay, you ready?
Okay, you're all set, yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. The title of my research is Cameroon Decolonization, the Bamileke War, UPC, and the French conflict. I decided to research on Cameroon because of the Algerian War that we studied in class, that the French were involved in both countries and they were fighting the Revolutionary War at the same time. So I think I found it really interesting that the French were fighting both countries at the same time. So I decided to find out what the French were doing in Cameroon. And this leads to my questions. Did the French involvement in Algeria conflict lead them to use more aggressive in Cameroon in hope of ending the conflict quickly? How did the UPC respond to French pressure during the War of the Bamileke? What were Amadou Ahijo's goal for Cameroon for Cameroon independence, and how did he pursue them? And lastly, did the UPC show more sign of violence than the French? And this will go to my thesis. And in order to maintain his relationship with France, Amadou Ahijo called for French help to destroy all the rebels of UPC, Union of People of Cameroon. The French sought to wrap things up quickly in Cameroon to focus on Algeria because the war in Algeria was the major concern for the French at this time. Mahamadou Ahijo and the French were not looking to grant full independence to Cameroon, which led to total chaos around the country. However, not only did the UPC terrorize the French, but anyone who followed Ahijo regime as well. And this will go to my background. And here I have the map pull up of Cameroon and Algeria. The first, Cameroon was under German control since the 1894. And it was not until the 1916 that the French and the British seized the territories from German. And there's division between the French Cameroon and British Cameroon. The British Cameroons occupied the northwest and the southwest of Cameroon, which are put in the red spot on the map. They're controlled by the British. And it was not until after the independence of Cameroon in 1961 that the British joined the Cameroons to form the Federal Republic of Cameroon. And I pull up like the Algerian War, here started in 1954 to 1962. The French was fighting the FLN, National Liberation Front, to kind of pull up, kind of end up everything in Algeria. And next, will be we continue with my background and the Ahijo and the UPC. The UPC was founded in 1947, and the picture on the right shows the four main leaders of the UPC. And in the middle, the man that stands in the middle is the head leader of the UPC. His name is Ruben Nuebe. And on the left side is Ahijo, Mohamedou Ahijo, sorry. He was born in 1924 in Garo, Cameroon, and he did not finish his complete his education, and he was a radio operator for the post office, and he did not really get into the political system until the 1947, which was the year that the UPC was founded. Next is my secondary sources, and I found this book really interesting. And the first one is, I really like the first one, The End of the French Rule in Cameroon, by Martin Atagana. Here, his main goal was to give historical information between the 1950s and 1960s that led to Cameroon independence. And his emphasis was how the French attempt to establish and maintain their presence after the departure by creating systems that would protect the interests in Cameroon. And my next book is Nation of Outlaw, State of Violence by Meredith Theata. Her major argument is that despite the disruption of French colonial administration and piecemeal immigration into the alien religion, America continued up through the 1960s based to their political and even cultural identity on the values chiefdom of the homeland. And next, I found the next book really interesting too, Diplomacy, National Building in Africa by Melanie Torrance. This is that Cameroon was central to the history of French and British decolonization process and foreign policy choices. Both country move into interaction that never manifests into in any other colonial setting. And my last book here is Gunless Africa, Cameroon under Mohamedou Ahijo. This book is just a collection of essays by different authors that describe the political system and the social critique in Cameroon, and also review some of the torture that the French did during this time. And going to my main argument about the Bamileke War in 1955 to 1964, French major threat. Sorry, I wanted to read this to you. In this article that in French, and I will explain to you in English. In 1955, Ruben said, nous sommes contre les colonistes et leurs hommes de main, qu'ils soient blancs, noirs ou jaunes. Et nous sommes les alliés de tous les partisans du droit des peuples et nations à disposer d'eux-mêmes sans considérer de couleur. So in 1955, Ruben said that they are against all the colonists and the army, whether they are black or white, black or yellow, and they are allowed people that supported the right of people in the nation without considering colors. So in 1955, the French banned the UPC because that summer the UPC were protesting for the freedom of the people to free themselves from the French and everything that they were doing in the country. So the French was trying to put stop to the protest. So and then everything turned out to be chaos. And the French end up throwing bombs to the crowd and smoke. So there was thousands and even like 1,000 people, children and family died there. So at the when the question come up to the council at the UN council, the French made up their own reason that the UPC started everything. It was just a campaign of terror and falsification. That the UPC made up their own story. That the French was the one that started everything. That they blamed the French to kill people by bombing. So the French was trying to deny what happened that day and trying to blame the UPC from starting for starting the riot. That they never threw bomb to the crowd. That it was just a loud, harmless grenade that they threw to the crowd to disperse everybody. Maybe a few people might get injured and stuff, but they never killed any civilian. So, and the picture I put down is on the front line where the main leader of the UPC. And moving on to the Bamileke War, French troop and the UPC. I put here my first point is the Haitian War. The Haitian War is basically the Bamileke War, and which is called the Haitian War as well. The French were trying to hide everything, all the activity uh, from the world, from everybody, because the war in Algeria seemed to be really heavy on them, and they were trying to put stop to that. So they didn't want the same thing to happen in Cameroon. So they sent troops to Cameroon to prevent the new Algeria. So the rebels in UPC, they didn't have massive weapons. They were armed with hatchets and knives, maybe shotgun or maybe club. Uh, so the French would have big advantage on them. So after the UPC members were banned from the system, they went to hide in Bamileke. So the French were trying to find where they were hiding. So they will go to different villages and try to ask people where the UPC member were hiding. So they will kill villages, children. It doesn't matter whether they are babies, women, anybody. They will burn houses down and kill anybody on the path. So when they found out that the UPC was settling in Bamileke, they decided to go there and do the same thing as well, burn the villages down. But the UPC were hiding deep in the jungle in Bamileke, so they could not be found easily. So after that, the followers of Reuben, they were not political concerned. They don't know anything about political system. They were just villagers that really like his idea of freedom, and they would do whatever he said and they follow him. But by 1958, Reuben was found in the forest, and the French gunned him down. They didn't try to arrest him. They didn't try to ask him what he was doing. They didn't ask him to do anything. They just killed him right away as soon as they found they killed him. So after that, the French gave temporary freedom to Cameroon because they killed their leader. They killed their rebel leader. They say so. The French will be the Cameroon will be free temporarily until later independence. And moving forward to the war of Bamileke, uh, the independence in 1960. Okay, in during the election day, uh, the people of Cameroon, the citizens didn't vote for who they want to be president. The vote took place at the UN Council. That the UN choose who they wanted to be president for Cameroon. So So there, Amadou Ahidjo was elected as the president of Cameroon, and after that, in a couple months, Amadou Ahidjo went to meet with French President Charles de Gaulle, and there were negotiations that took place, and the French were still in control. After the French were still in control of Cameroon, and they used him as a puppet. He's still Cameroon French puppet, and he does everything that the French ask him to. So there, the violence really increased when Mahamadou Ahidjo uh, became president. The violence really increased, and the UPC they really rise even after the head leader died. So the UPC took all the activity to the city, and they would go to any places like any uh, theater that is any French theater, French bar, and they will kill anybody that they think is part of Ahidjo or French regime. So Ahidjo had to take responsibility to call out for French again to come back and help take care of the rebels. So the French, they just to show him that okay, like he needs their help, that he cannot control the government by himself. So they came and they successfully kind of eased everything down, and the violence kind of decreased a little bit. So later on, Ahidjo he wanted to rule his own country, so he removed everything, any symbol of French in the government, and say that he will not be part of French community anymore. So he would have a hard time since then. So by 1982, he decided to resign and leave, and he moved to he leave Cameroon uh, to live in Dakar. Nobody know why he left. Uh, some of the research I looked up, like he has some problem with the French and the people of the military. He's scared to be killed, so uh, he left and then went to live in Senegal. And but he was president for 22 years in Cameroon, and after him was Paul Biya, and everything, nothing didn't get better from there. Since Paul Biya became president, nothing got better. So he got even worse when Paul Biya got president. And this is my conclusion. The French interest in both countries, Algeria and Cameroon, had been influenced by the pursuit of political and economic power. And the French seemed to intimidate the colonists with rules. After the Second World War, French wanted to maintain the colonial power, which most likely start brutality if the colony reject or resist the rule. French went to war with Algeria because they were resisting the authority. This led to the rise of the FLN party to fight the French. At the same time, the French were facing another rebels movement in Cameroon. This time, Amadou Ahidjo was viewed as a as puppet of French, and he decided to work with the French through negotiation to grant full autonomy in his government. Unfortunately, French Cameroon and British Cameroon were never seemed to be at peace throughout the Revolutionary War because there were many rebel movements such as the UPC that did not support the Ahidjo regime. When the Cameroon was granted full independence, the country never there was still violence in the country.
Okay. All right. So very good, Armel. Everybody can hear me. At this point in time, we will shift in the direction of questions for Armel. I think you had a good and interesting topic, and probably not well-traveled territory for a lot of folks. So I'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, I got a question, Dr. Campbell.
Yes.
TT, that was really good. That was really interesting. You did a good job. Something I wanted to ask you is, I don't think I've ever really learned about Cameroon, like really probably at all. And so we definitely didn't cover Cameroon specifically in Dr. Campbell's class. So my question for you is like, how did you land on this topic? And did you know anything before going into this topic, or did you have to do a lot of kind of upfront research to learn some more things?
Well, it was for me, the Cameroon now, I had to like look up a lot of stuff because this was kind of challenging because I didn't know a lot about Cameroon. I know about Cameroon, but I didn't know uh, how they became free from the French. So because my country, myself, I'm from Benin, which was colonized by the French as well, but there was not a lot of information that was recorded from them. So working with Cameroon is kind of challenging because I have to like look up all the countries basically that have the same thing as Algeria. So when I got to Cameroon, I saw the dates when the war started. The dates is like, oh, the war started like 1955, and I look up Algeria was 1955. I was like, okay, so the French was fighting both countries at the same time. So let me check out what is going on here and see, kind of compare, kind of do like Google comparison. So that's where I came up with Cameroon because the world kind of seemed to be kind of similar. And the most interesting thing is like the world in Cameroon was not like nobody knows about the world in Cameroon. Like maybe few people know about it because the French were basically kind of hide everything, everything is sacred. So because of the Algerian war, like the Algerian like kind of view the French as like a major threat to them, and so that's just how I came up with it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, Cooper, and thank you, Armel. Very good answer. Other questions?
This is Dr. Nelson. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. They say I have a nice picture. I can't really see it, so my camera's never worked on this laptop. So I really enjoyed that. I was really interested when you talked about how the French wanted to avoid a new Algeria. And what I was actually wondering is, given that when this starts in 1955, do we see on either side, either the French side or the side of the UPC, of appealing or looking to Vietnam and what had happened with the French over in the First Indochina War, which they had lost the previous year? Do we see the French trying to avoid another Vietnam, so to speak, or do we see African rebels perhaps appealing to or encouraged by the defeat of French colonialism over in Southeast Asia?
It's like that's a good question because it's kind of interesting that the French really trying to avoid the Vietnamese war to happen because like I was reading some document that was talking about the UPC was sort of the Vietnam, kind of similar to Vietnam, mixed, rebel. So I was like, okay, so the French basically were trying to avoid a massive war that really cost them a lot. After what happened in Algeria, they're trying to in Vietnam, they're trying to avoid all that to happen in Cameroon. So when they found out that the rebels was rising in Cameroon, they were trying to like send troops to Cameroon and put everything to an end. So, but they didn't want to do it for the people to know that they were doing it. They just wanted to use the Cameroon government in the front and they kind of like manipulate them to do what they say, what they ask them to do, so they can like stop the UPC rebels. So basically, yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay. All right. Very well. Very good question and well responded.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell.
I wish we could see you live and in person, Dr. Nelson, but we'll have to just accept just the picture only.
I have tried to get the camera fixed, but you know how the IT world works here at PC sometimes.
Speaking of the IT world of PC, Dr. Vicky, you joined us recently.
Correct. So I was actually able to, I'm not sure if you guys saw me, I was able to see the whole presentation, but I think I was actually in the streaming version of it because I couldn't see you guys, but this is, I don't know, but at least I was able to get this really interesting presentation. So thanks very much for that.
So kind of like the hidden war, you were the hidden Vicky. Sorry, this is called the hidden war, the Bamileke war. So you're the hidden Vicky.
Yeah, exactly, the hidden Vicky, sniping from the forest. So I wanted to actually piggyback on what Dr. Nelson was saying, because from what I know, and I'm not very familiar with Cameroon at all, but I did a lot of reading on Algeria, and I think you mentioned this several times. There's no question in my mind that the French learned the wrong lessons almost from Vietnam, and applied them to Algeria and failed in both cases. And now I hear the third case where they try to avoid what happened, and they seem to actually do it all over again. It's interesting to me that the French really try to find a military solution often more than a political solution, and don't see the more obvious course, which is what the British are doing, which is kind of just abandon it, just be like, okay, we had our run, we ruled this long enough, and then they just try to get out like they did in India. And I think so. I think the British seem to learn better of like what to do than the French. Would you agree with that, Armel? Or what do you think could have been a better strategy for the French side to kind of avoid these debacles?
Well, like I kind of agree with what you say, that the French was really trying to avoid everything, like what happened in Vietnam, and to apply to Algeria. So my main thing is that the French, like you say, how the French to like kind of avoid it. Like I don't see any situation that they can really avoid it, because the French kind of seem to really greedy. They were really greedy into all those colonies. So they want to take over the political and even to the economy. So I don't see where they was trying to be like, okay, the easy way is to be like, okay, leave them alone and leave the country. But they would not want to do that. So they want to impose their power, impose everything on people. And even the people trying to fight back, they're trying to resist them and fight back too. So they didn't want to make it easy for anyone, basically. So they want to put the power on every colony that they step into. So that's what they're doing. So there's no like any solution of them to be like make it better for themselves. They're making it harder. Even in Algeria, the violence kind of increased. From the beginning, it was easy, but like everything was just went up high because the rebel got tired of it. So they took everything to them by doing the same thing that Cameroon did. Take it to the city, bomb all this French bomb, airport, everything. So all that kind of like put a lot of pressure on the French and the French government in the homeland. So that kind of put them in a bad spot. So that's what they're really trying to avoid Cameroon to happen, because they learned a lot of lessons in Cameroon and in Vietnam that the best solution is leave them people alone. So
let it go.
That's what they're trying to do. That's what, and they end up
frozen.
They end up doing it in Algeria. That the French president say, okay, we have to leave them alone. That whatever is going on, they cannot afford another war in Algeria. So that's why they're really scared to do the same thing in Cameroon, and they try to do it like secret. That's what it's called, a hidden war, basically.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right. In many ways, the best lesson would be, just don't do what the French do.
Yeah.
But you're right. Thank you.
So thank you for that question, Dr. Vicky, and also for that very good and nuanced answer, Armel. I don't know if you guys noticed, but in the top right of my screen, I see Emily Swanigan, who will be presenting on Algeria at the very conclusion of this session. And so some of those bigger questions that you guys are thinking about and asking, she'll be addressing from a kind of philosophical perspective at the end. So Emily, we'll be eager to hear from you later. So we are close on the time for our next presentation. So Armel, good job. We're going to go and head and start transitioning to our next presentation.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And so I'm going to introduce to you another one of our seniors, and this is Sarah Myers. She has actually located to a classroom today to make sure it seems extra official. So if you see the chalkboard behind her, that's why. And I'm not going to tell you, she's going to give you a little bit of an introduction as to kind of how she got into this topic, which I think is quite fascinating. And so I will pass it on to Sarah Myers.
Okay, everything's good. You can see the slide and everything.
Everything's great.
Okay, perfect. So, hi, I'm Sarah Myers. Good afternoon. Today I will be discussing the women of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, challenging traditional gender stereotypes and their clash with patriarchal systems. So for those of you who might not know, I studied abroad in Belfast, Northern Ireland last year, and I'm also a women and gender studies minor. So when it came time to picking my overall general topic for this capstone research, it was pretty clear that I wanted to research women and the Troubles. However, upon initial research, I found that a lot of the past research on women and the Troubles has been on how they have been indirectly impacted by the conflict. For example, a lot of research has been done on women who may have had male family members who have died as a result of the conflict. So I decided that I wanted to look at women who were more directly involved in the conflict, which led me to the following research questions. What were the roles that women took on during the conflict of Northern Ireland, known as the Troubles? Did women engage in more peace-building or combative roles? And what were the various experiences of women who assumed more active roles in the conflict? So my thesis is that women assumed both peaceful and combative roles in the conflict, yet they are most often depicted and remembered for their contribution to the peace-building process. Women who assumed active roles in combat and peace-building experienced sexism due to the patriarchal norms of the society. So for my background history, I chose this map of Northern Ireland, Ireland, and Great Britain just to show that that northern region of Northern Ireland is still part of the UK to this day. In the 17th century, people from Scotland and England were encouraged to migrate over to that northern part of Northern Ireland, which became known as Ulster Plantation. And most of those people who migrated were Protestants, leading to a Protestant majority in the northern part of Ireland and a Catholic majority in the south. Over the 1800s and early 20th century, we see a lot of Irish nationalism growing throughout the island, which culminated in the Easter Rising of 1916. This was a rebellion by Irish nationalists that was largely unsuccessful. However, the disproportionate response of the British towards the rebellion actually garnered quite a bit of support from the Irish public for the nationalist cause and enabled them to fight in the Anglo-Irish War from 1919 to 1921. The war ended with the result of the Irish Free State, which lasted from 1921 to 1949. However, that northern part of Ireland with the Protestant majority was not included in the Irish Free State and remained part of the United Kingdom and remains part of the United Kingdom to this day. In the 1950s and 60s, we see a lot of Catholic discrimination popping up throughout Northern Ireland, especially in the form of voting restrictions, gerrymandering, and a lot of housing discrimination. And this led to a civil rights effort developing in the 60s. A lot of those marches, demonstrations, protests, especially towards the end of the 60s in 67, 68, and 69, quite a few of them erupted in violence, which led to the beginning of the Troubles in 1969. Towards the beginning of the Troubles, the late 60s, early 70s, we see internment happening throughout Northern Ireland, where people who were suspected of being involved in Irish nationalism, especially paramilitary organizations like the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, they were arrested, held, and imprisoned without trial. There were quite a few protests to this practice, including one of the most infamous instances of violence, Bloody Sunday, which happened in 1972. In 1972, prisoners who were convicted of offenses related to the Troubles were granted a special category status. Essentially, they were seen as prisoners of war. However, this status was revoked in 1976 because it was seen as giving legitimacy to the Irish nationalist cause, and that led to quite a few prison strikes throughout the rest of the decade and throughout the 80s, with the goal of regaining that special category status. The Troubles came to an end through a series of ceasefires, grassroots peacemaking efforts, and peace talks that culminated in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, also known as the Belfast Agreement of 1998. So for my secondary sources, I knew that I wanted to look at both sources that reviewed women in their peace-building capacity, as well as women who were involved in the conflict as combatants. So first we have Peace Women, Gender and Peace Building in Northern Ireland by Marie Hammond-Callaghan, which is a chapter from her book, Building Peace in Northern Ireland. In this chapter, Hammond-Callaghan really emphasizes cross-community and grassroots efforts by women towards peace. And she also gives a historical perspective of peace building and feminism. She discusses women in World War I and World War II who were strong advocates for peace. The next source we have is Women's Role in the Resolution of the Northern Ireland Conflict by Marianne Ford. In this work, Ford gives an overview of the peace process and how women were involved in the formal political institutions of Northern Ireland. She discusses the patriarchal political system of Northern Ireland and how it was very male-dominated at the time. She also discusses the role of the media, how the media really liked to focus on male politicians at the time, and didn't really talk a lot about the women of the Troubles. Next, we have Cumann na Bun, Women in Irish Republican Paramilitary Organizations by Dita Rienish. Cumann na Bun is a female paramilitary organization which was largely active in the Anglo-Irish War, but it was also active during the Troubles. So Rienish gives a history of Cumann na Bun, and he also discusses how there's very little archival material, very few records were kept on female combatants. So his history was very dependent on oral history, especially interviews. Finally, we have Women as Agents of Political Violence, Gendering Security by Miranda Allison, which is a comparison of female combatants in Northern Ireland and Sri Lanka. And of course, I focused on the parts about Northern Ireland. In this work, Allison focuses on ethnic conflict and how it's a lot easier for women to become involved in nationalist movements or ethnic conflict rather than traditional interstate conflicts. So as my secondary sources showed me, there's very little archival material and very few records were kept on women who were directly involved in the conflict. So I chose to take a sample of women who were involved in the conflict using interviews and newspaper articles to compare their experiences and give a narrative to my research. So the first woman I chose was Dolores Price. She grew up in Northern Ireland and became involved in the civil rights movement. However, she was drawn to the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, in 1972, and she was actually one of the first women who joined the IRA as a volunteer. She performed quite a few tasks in her first year or two in the IRA, which included cleaning weapons, transferring weapons and supplies across the border, and even placing bombs throughout Northern Ireland. In 1973, she and several other volunteers expanded the conflict beyond Northern Ireland to England, in which they placed a bomb outside of a court building in London, and the bomb detonated and injured over 200 people. Price and the other volunteers were arrested, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment in England. Price, almost immediately after being imprisoned, started a hunger strike with the goal of being relocated to Northern Ireland. Her hunger strike lasted over 200 days, and about 20 days into her hunger strike, she was strapped down to a table by a prison doctor. She had a tube forced down her throat, and she was force-fed for the remainder of her hunger strike. After about 200 days of hunger striking, she was eventually transferred to Armagh Prison in Northern Ireland, where she served a portion of the remainder of her sentence until she was released on humanitarian grounds due to the trauma that she had developed from her force feeding. She did not really rejoin the conflict or the IRA, so that's where my research really stopped for her. However, I did want to point out that the newspaper articles that I found discussing Price, especially her force feeding and her hunger strike, largely focused on the men who were also hunger striking at the same time, and didn't really mention Price other than in passing. Next, we have Marie Farrell. She grew up in a Catholic-dominated neighborhood in Belfast where she witnessed various instances of violence and discrimination. She was drawn to join the IRA in 1975, where she participated in several bombing campaigns and then was later arrested for her involvement. She actually led the female prison protests of Armagh Prison from 1976 to 1986, where she served as the officer commanding of the female IRA prisoners. She was later released from prison. She immediately rejoined the movement and was sent to Gibraltar, where she was killed by British troops, and she became a martyr for the movement. Throughout Belfast and Northern Ireland, there are many murals and commemorations for those people who died throughout the conflict. And you can see on the screen here a photograph of one of those murals in Belfast. This mural is dedicated to the women who died, and you can see Farrell is the woman pictured in the top right corner. Finally, we have Monica McWilliams. She was also a participant in the civil rights movement and a strong advocate for women's rights. However, unlike Price and Farrell, she was not drawn to violence or the IRA, and she continued to work towards peace through grassroots peacemaking efforts throughout the entire conflict. In 1996, she co-founded the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, a small political party in Northern Ireland. That political party was chosen to participate in the peace talks, meaning that McWilliams was one of 3 women who participated in the peace talks. And throughout those peace talks and the peace-building process, McWilliams provided a strong voice for the women of Northern Ireland and how the conflict had impacted their lives. You can see pictured here, the picture on the left is a photograph of women of the Women's Coalition. Monica McWilliams is the one sitting down in blue in the middle. And the photograph on the right is actually a photograph of the Belfast Agreement with all of the signatures of those who were involved in the peace talks. So in one of her interviews, Monica McWilliams was asked how it was that women were essentially written out of the history of Northern Ireland, especially the Troubles, and she referred to this photograph. In this photograph, there are 3 women and many more who were not pictured, who were involved in planning and organizing a march in response to Bloody Sunday. However, when it came time to line up for the march, the women discovered that men who were also involved were the ones who wanted to lead the march. They wanted to take the front. Those women said, no, we did a lot of the planning, and for once we want to lead the march. And as you can see, they linked arms and took the front of the group. Monica McWilliams in her interview said, these women have, quote, literally been written out of history. These are women with no names because no one remembers their names. All the men in the row behind all became famous, and they are written into history, and people do know their names, end quote. And this is actually something that I experienced in my own research, this rewriting of history to exclude women. The Conflict Archive on the internet is an online database with information about the Troubles, and it was a strong source that I used for my background information and just to get me started on my research. On the website, they have a list of key people who were involved in the conflict, and something I found is that there weren't very many women listed on that list of key people, and the women who were listed, the information about them was very limited in comparison to the men who were also on that list. So finally, patriarchal hierarchies and sexism. All 3 women, Price, Farrell, and McWilliams, experienced sexism throughout the Troubles, whether it was through the patriarchal hierarchy of the IRA and limitations placed on female volunteers. Here we have a picture of a poster for the Belfast Brigade, in which both Price and Farrell served. And in one of her interviews, Price asserted that there were very many commanding officer positions in the Belfast Brigade, but it was essentially assumed that a woman would never reach that type of leadership position in the IRA. Monica McWilliams also experienced quite a bit of patriarchy and sexism in her experience with formal political institutions that were heavily male-dominated and pretty hostile towards women. You can see the picture on the right. This is a photograph of the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Belfast Agreement. Not everyone who participated in the peace talks is present for the picture, but you can see how clearly male-dominated that the peace talks and peace process was. In conclusion, the research clearly shows that there were many ways in which women were directly involved in the troubles of Northern Ireland. Women such as Price, Farrell, and McWilliams challenged traditional gender norms despite the patriarchal systems in which they operated. Women were directly involved in conflict and the peace process. However, historians often portray women through their contribution to peace. Women directly engaged in combat in the peace process, but are often only remembered for their efforts towards peace. And now I'll take any questions.
Okay, very well done, Sarah. And you saw Dr. Vicky clapping and others as well. So we have some time for some questions, and I know Sarah's eager to receive any questions you have. So
I have a question.
Okay.
You know, we study Algeria in class, and we talk about how women were involved in the war, and they use women as to access to some places that men cannot have access to. So, how would you compare women involvement in the trouble and the women in the involvement in the Algerian war?
Yeah, that's a great. I would say it's pretty similar, actually. I remember talking about the Algerian War and that women were chosen to place bombs a lot of times, and that actually is something that happened in Northern Ireland as well. Women were seen as less threatening, so they were chosen to transfer weapons across the border, to place bombs, to do sort of that more the more aggressive actions, because men were the people who were expected to be doing those. So the women were seen as less threatening, and that's why they were chosen to do those types of tasks.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Go ahead, Emily.
So your research, I know we've talked about it, but I think it's really commendable because I wouldn't even think of, and again, it's just I guess like maybe even hidden sexism that I like had toward this concept, but never really even considered the role that women had. And this is a question I'm not really sure if you know or if your research brought up to this point at all, but like on your last two slides, you talked about how I think with McWilliams was like obviously standing alone with all those men. Is that still like in terms of obviously government positions? Do you know if it's still unproportional like that, or if that's changed? If not, it's okay. I know that goes up to now, but
yeah, it's a great question.
I just wanted to
unfortunately, the Northern Ireland government hasn't really been functioning in the last few years. But I will say that in my experience, my family and we did a tour of the Belfast City Hall, and they have portraits of all of the mayors of the city. And in recent years, there have been quite a few women mayors. So I think it's changing, but it's not quite full yet.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
Okay, very good question, Emily. And for those who are on this discussion, if you can mute your microphones, I think Dr. Nelson has a question next. Armel, I think that we'll get a little feedback on the mic. So I'll get you to mute yours, and I'll pass it over to Dr. Nelson.
Sarah, great job. Really interesting. I'm kind of wondering if we take this the next step, and what I mean by that is if we look at the political vision that these women had, was there something? Did it go beyond just political independence? Did it actually embrace a progressive vision of equal rights for women? In other words, were they part? To what degree are they part of this united front fighting for a common political independence? But did we see any difference of what that meant to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think Monica McWilliams would be a great example of that, how she wasn't just an advocate for peace, she was an advocate for women's rights as well. And so she incorporated that into all of her work. I mean, during the peace talks, she talked a lot about how the presence of guns throughout the conflict, how it negatively impacted women and how it led to an increase in domestic violence for women. And so I think that's something that she brought to the table, and how she brought her experience with women and her experience with peacemaking to those peace talks, and she combined them all together.
Okay. So as a follow-up,
Mhm.
could that potentially be a reason as to why these people are written out of history? That added vision of women's rights was too far, that we have to reject that wholeheartedly. We can embrace this, and I'm just trying to see if it goes, if there's a political sort of explanation for them being written out.
Yeah, I didn't really find anything in my research that suggested that, but it wouldn't surprise me if people who were writing the history about the Troubles wanted the focus to be on the violence and the men that were involved. Especially those people who were involved in the IRA who might have been writing that history, especially those men who were in the positions of power. They might want that to be more of the focus of the writing of the history rather than women, if that makes sense.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Mhm.
Sarah,
Yeah.
just kind of in hearing these good questions from Emily and Armel and from Dr. Nelson, it just kind of led me to think, because a lot of what you framed this in within this context of patriarchy. And certainly this is a topic that deals mostly with politics and deals mostly with the Troubles from a socio-political perspective, women's rights. Was there anything in your literature that addressed any kind of Catholic influence on this? Because certainly Christianity is patriarchal in general. The Catholic Church certainly celebrates kind of traditional gender norms. And so do you see any of that influence creeping into it from the Catholic side?
Not directly, but I think it doesn't even have to be specific to Catholic.
Yeah.
I think just the Protestant, the Catholic, the fact that religion is such an important thing to these people in this region, and both the Catholic Church and the more traditional Protestant evangelical churches of Northern Ireland, England, Great Britain are also patriarchal. I think that would have a big influence on the whole way that women are talked about in the history.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great answer. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Others?
Dr. Campbell, I have a question.
Yes. Go for it, Cooper.
Sarah, something I was wondering, I've kind of wondered this as we've been kind of following you in your research this semester. How much of women not having a historical role in the Troubles, how much of it is there was a lot of women involved and nobody talked about it, or women weren't even kind of let through the doorway of even helping in the effort?
I think it was most definitely the first option. Women were clearly involved in peacemaking and combat in the conflict. One of my secondary sources, the one about Kamandaban, the female paramilitary organization, discussed how there was a change in leadership in the 70s, which meant that a lot of the archives and records that they had were actually burned in a fire on purpose. And so that's maybe one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of information about women in the Troubles, because I think there's this stigma against women speaking out in the Troubles, and so a lot of them preferred to work either behind the scenes, or they didn't like to take credit for their work as much. Might be the reason why they burned all those archival materials, all the records and stuff like that.
Okay, very good.
I had a question. It might be, probably totally beyond the scope also of your work, but I always think it's useful to kind of take a comparative approach. And it struck me when you presented on the topic of women in organizations that actually do bombings and terror, then right away it came to my mind that there is this very famous terrorist organization in Germany during the same time, 1970s, in which there are very prominent women, actually, that was kind of shocking to German society. It's called the Red Army Faction, the Baader-Meinhof gang. Baader was the leader, but Meinhof was the woman who was kind of the intellectual, actually, of that group. And so it was very clear that there were two women, you could say, in a very small group and in very important positions. And I wondered about what that says, that in Germany there was this, like shock that women would be involved in bombing campaigns that almost catapulted them into an important position where people wanted to know all about these women. Why are they doing this? And there doesn't seem to be the same kind of interest for that when it comes to Irish IRA terrorism, or when you want to see it from the other side, liberation struggle, that somehow would make especially women actually the interest, because in some ways it's almost like this assumption, oh yeah, men are violent, so there must obviously be the leaders there. But here we have two women of what you account for, that are both involved in the actual fight. Shouldn't that be in some ways shocking and or of interest for the people? So I thought it was interesting that you kind of find this to be a non-issue. In fact, they are actually suppressed almost in the acknowledgement part of that struggle. Do you think there's a difference between, I don't know, German society, Irish society? I know that Dr. Campbell referred to Irish Catholicism as a potential reason for that. I don't know if that plays a big role. Germany is mostly Protestant. Not sure if that makes any difference at all. Do you find any other organizations where women are in prominent positions theoretically, but not are talked about at all?
It's a great point. I think with the topics that we've all been researching this semester with Algeria, the troubles you mentioned in Germany, and even that article that discussed Sri Lankan combatants, I think it's very clear that women are involved in combat. I think one of the most important determinants whether those women are celebrated or erased from history would be the culture. I think in my experience and in my view, the culture of Northern Ireland is not very welcoming to women in positions of leadership. And so I think that probably has a big role in why women who were involved in the Troubles as combatants were not really celebrated or discussed as much as opposed to maybe Germany.
Thank you. Another thing, and again, I'm not sure if you could answer this question. I wondered about if women who actually were in favor of the peace process were maligned or even seen as traitors because they obviously are opposing the violent methods that the IRA was thinking would kind of propel the British to eventually let go of Northern Ireland, as they had done over the Republic of Ireland. Were women seen as somehow hindering that struggle in general, or were they perceived as the peacemakers who finally ended this horror?
I think it definitely depends on the perspective that you're coming from towards the conflict. If you're coming from a Catholic nationalist background, that might be how you view these women who participated in peace. I will say that, like, upon my first bit of research, I found that a lot of the research is on women in peace building. And so I think especially the media, while they might not talk about women as much, what they do say about women in peace building is positive for the most part. It's not really negative. They're not really painting women in a bad light. So I think it definitely depends on where you're coming from, what your background is, and definitely what your political beliefs were at the time.
Thank you so much.
So, kind of in transition, unless I have another question, unless someone else does, I can save it. Does anyone else have a pressing question they want to ask? So, my question is simple, because you did a lot of research on this, Sarah, and you made it. You've got really invested in the topic. You've given us a sampling of some of your research, right, with Dolores Price and the others, Monica McWilliams. So the question I have is simply, like, why these three, and of course two we're looking at as combatants, one as someone in the peace movement. Why these three as your sampling?
Well, I'll be honest, I chose Monica McWilliams before I even really settled on this topic and doing the comparison. Monica McWilliams actually studied at the school that I went to, Queen's University, so I felt a connection to her in some way. And while I was abroad, I actually took a class on women in politics, and we had 1 week of lectures where we talked about women in the conflict, and Monica McWilliams was one of those women mentioned. So that's how I found her. And the other two, I didn't know anything about before starting the research. I just found their stories really compelling. And there are also some of the more notable women from the conflict. There are probably thousands of other women who were involved, whether that was directly as volunteers in the IRA, or as we discussed, if they were women who lived in a neighborhood where there was a lot of conflict and they helped by warning people or hiding weapons in their homes or stuff like that. So I chose Price and Farrell just because their stories really spoke to me and they seemed very interesting in that sense.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, very good. So we are at 129, and thank you all for the questions, and thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. We will start transitioning to our next topic, and so thank you again, Sarah. So for all the people out there on the live stream, we've heard from Armel TeTe, we've heard from Sarah Myers, Armel on Cameroon, and Sarah on Women of the Troubles. We have 2 more presentations left in this session on colonialism and its after effects. And at this time, I would like to introduce, as he pulls up his PowerPoint, Andrew Tezza. Andrew Tezza is one of our history majors who's also involved very actively in ROTC. And so I think without giving too much away, as you see his presentation unfold, you'll get the connection to his approach and kind of understand where he's coming from with it. So I'll give you Andrew Tezza. And Andrew, I think your sound is off and we're not able to see you at the moment.
Is that better?
There we go. Perfect.
All right. And can you all see the presentation okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. Well, today I will be presenting on the Battle of Mogadishu and its effects on American society. So to start with an introduction, I would really like to begin with what the Battle of Mogadishu was. It was it started on October 3rd and 4th in 1993 in Mogadishu, Somalia. It was a prolonged firefight between Somali militias and United States Special Forces. And it resulted in heavy American casualties while the mission was still technically a success. Some of the research questions I followed while I was trying to look into this battle were, why was the battle important? What was it about it that the military learned from, that the American government learned from, and what changes occurred from those things? I was additionally looking at whether or not the media coverage of the Battle of Mogadishu affected the decisions made by the Clinton administration immediately afterwards. My thesis for this presentation and research was that the Battle of Mogadishu had wide-reaching ramifications across both political and military spheres. The rapid withdrawal and ensuing reluctance to be involved elsewhere set a precedent for the United States that has continued to this day. Some of the secondary sources I used, I have them split between 2 slides because this slide is sources that came from a United States government perspective, and the second slide will be sources that came from a civilian perspective. One of the secondary sources I used a lot of was one called Withdrawing with Honor by Major David C. Hazelton. He wrote it in order to compare the withdrawal from Mogadishu to the withdrawal from Vietnam, to compare it with the Russian withdrawal from Afghanistan, in order to find out what went wrong, what went right, what could be learned from for the United States in the future. It was a fairly objective viewpoint, as objective as you can get when you're writing from the military for the military. The second source that I used was the Somalia After Action Report, written by Dr. Richard Stewart in employment of the United States Army. This source was taken from multiple accounts, reports, all across the Somalian theater from the entire time the United States was in Somalia from 1992 to 1994. So it didn't only cover one certain part, it was across the entire thing. And this one was just a large scale of the previous source, where it's trying to find mistakes made, improvements that could be implemented, whatever the military can learn from. Now for the civilian secondary sources, I used The Battle of Mogadishu, An Anatomy of a Failure by Roger Sangvik. Judging by the title, he viewed the battle as a failure. He argued that had the United States committed more resources, made better preparations, not been so overconfident mainly in going into this engagement, that it could have been turned around quite easily and casualties could have been avoided. Lester Bruin's book, The United States and Post-Cold War Interventions, focuses on Somalia, Haiti, and Bosnia. For the Somalia section of this book, he focuses on the political aspects, mostly the Clinton administration's reaction and what happened afterwards, how it's continued for the few years that he covers. For a little bit of background information, I'd like to start with talking about the Somali Civil War. The setup for the Somali Civil War began in 1969 when President Mohammed Siad Barre took power. He reigned in a dictatorial position until 1991 when he was forcibly ousted. Well, his government was forcibly ousted and the country began to break into factions. All of these different colors on the map to the right represent factions, and the orange one is the remnants of his government. That 1991 also marks the death of the Somali Democratic Republic. Just for reference, the green section on the map is where Mogadishu is, on the coastline right about the middle. For a little bit more background, more recent, in 1992, after Somalia had been devastated by famine and plague, war, all of it just going on, it was an awful place to be. The United Nations decided they had to step in and try and do something to make things at least a little bit easier for the civilians and people there. So UNISOM 1 took place. UNISOM stands for United Nations Operations in Somalia. And the goal of this mission was to alleviate the famine, try and broker peace between the warlords that had taken control of the nation. And it was successful in the beginning. Towards the end, it became more of a failure, more ineffective. They were able to broker a few peace agreements and ceasefires, but those were ignored very quickly. And due to the limited staff they had, the shipments of food and supplies for agriculture were seized by the warlords and used as leverage against the people. In December of 1992, UNITAF took over from UNISOM 1. UNITAF stands for United Task Force. It was an American-led operation, better known as Operation Restore Hope. This one was not humanitarian so much as it was laying the groundwork for another humanitarian operation. The goal for UNITAF was to secure ports, roads, airfields, anything that could make the next operation run smoother and be more of a success than the first. They were more successful than UNISOM 1 was, but they only ended up capturing about a third of their objectives and being able to secure things. But it was a start. UNISOM 2 took over from UNITAF in May of 1993, and it continued until March of 1995. The United States was only involved until 1994. UNISOM 2 was much more of a success in the beginning due to the groundwork that had been laid by UNITAF. It was able to distribute food properly. They had enough personnel. They increased from 1,900 personnel to 22,000 from UNISOM 1 to UNISOM 2. And due to this increase, they were able to effectively kind of assert their dominance over the warlords and make them actually hold to the ceasefires that they signed. The battle organization for Operation Gothic Serpent, which is the code name for the Battle of Mogadishu, it wasn't meant to be as long as it was. The operation was intended to be a quick, less than 2-hour snatch and grab mission in order to capture 2 of General Mohammed Farah Aidid's top lieutenants. Mohammed Farah Aidid was the warlord who controlled most of the area around Somalia, and he was the UN's biggest enemy in Somalia at this time. These lieutenants were going to be used as leverage against Aidid or to gain information about his operations in order to take him down. The week before this battle took place, a United States helicopter was shot down outside of the city, which was kind of foreshadowing for this battle. The goal was only to go in on helicopters, rope in, capture the lieutenants, and drive out in a convoy, in and out. But as things went wrong more and more, United States soldiers got bogged down in the city, and things just went from bad to worse until the United States called in the United Nations, and they got help and got the soldiers out. Technically speaking, in terms of the United States military and its records, the mission was a success because they were able to successfully capture the 2 lieutenants alive and bring them back to the United States base. One of the major factors after the battle that really caused a big change for the United States was media coverage. Prior to the battle, the United States had already had a problem with Somali media coverage. There were Somali news crews and even people just running around with video cameras handheld, taking videos of United States raids, United Nations patrols, things like that. They were inflating numbers of civilian casualties to make the UN and the United States look bad, which in turn caused more Western journalists to have interest in the conflict. When they came, they kind of did the same thing, not to the same degree as the Somali journalists did, but it all left a bad taste in the mouth of the United Nations and the United States. Due to this false reporting, the United States soldiers in the region, which requested additional equipment and resources in order to be able to conduct their missions better, they had this denied due to fear of the United States destroying the city. The government was afraid that it would look bad if they brought in heavier vehicles like tanks or heavier planes to cover their troops. It would look like they were just going to take over and invade. So that didn't happen, which led to the failure of the mission. Looking at the bottom left image on this screen, that is an American soldier who was dragged through the streets after he was dead in Somalia. That was one of the images that was widely spread around after the battle, and it very much led to the United States pulling out of Somalia. The public in America was, as soon as they saw this image, they were disgusted, they were horrified. They started questioning why America was even in Somalia. Now, for lessons learned by the military in Somalia, it didn't place a very high priority on media relations, as mentioned before. One of the recommendations in the Somalia After Action Report, the AAR, was to include JIB teams. These Joint Information Bureau teams have a job to directly work with journalists, media outlets, in order to properly represent and report things that have gone on the military side, on the civilian side, what they're doing to help the nation, whether or not things go right or wrong, as of course all of it's within the boundaries of not putting the troops in danger. These teams consist of 32 men and they're a big resource, but after the Battle of Mogadishu, it was recommended that they were included in all future foreign American theaters, and they have been. Immediately after the battle as well, one was sent to Somalia to try and do damage control. It was too little too late, however, and the United States withdrew within 6 months. Another lesson learned by the military was that better communications were needed. One of the problems during the Battle of Mogadishu was that while the convoys were trying to get out of the city, they had to go through multiple middlemen in order to contact their higher command and get directions. So what ended up happening was they would drive past an intersection, and then a minute, 2 minutes later, they would get directions to turn around, go back to that intersection, and make a turn, which ultimately kept them in the city longer. They took more losses, more casualties, and it was much more than it needed to be. The military since then has streamlined communications in high-risk situations, or what has been deemed as high-risk situations, as was included in the Somalia After Action Report. For policy changes, an immediate policy change by the Clinton administration signed the day after the Battle of Mogadishu concluded was Presidential Decision Directive 25, which changed the United States criteria for joining and continuing in humanitarian missions. It changed the missions from at the UN's discretion to at the United States discretion, and that discretion was, does the United States think that the UN can complete the mission without us? More often than not, that answer has been yes, they can. Regardless of the outcome, it has been used as a justification to stay out of missions, such as in Rwanda in 1994. The Rwandan genocide took place from April to July in 1994, and the United States did little more than say, this is happening, we aren't getting involved. The United Nations followed suit, unfortunately, and instead of increasing their presence in Rwanda, as the conflict escalated, they decreased. They dropped their troops from 5,000 to 1,900. Continuing on that trend, the United States has had a lack of involvement in humanitarian crises since 1993, mentioning the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis afterwards. The United States was reluctant to commit anything more than air power. In conclusion, despite the success or seeming success of Operation Gothic Serpent, the Battle of Mogadishu left the United States in an uneasy state, with a lack of control leading to its relative withdrawal from the world stage and a reluctance to change anytime soon. Are there any questions?
Okay, very good, Andrew. Thank you so much. And I will now, and I see Dr. V clapping as well. What do you guys do out there in college land? You do snaps? Okay, so that's what we're doing. So questions for Andrew.
Yeah, I've got a question, Dr. Campbell.
Yes, go ahead, Cooper.
Andrew, that was really good. That was really interesting. A question I had, and you actually just kind of addressed it a little bit. I was going to ask you about Syria. And what I was going to ask is, when I've had conversations and learned about like Syria and why the Obama administration chose not to really go and do anything, and even now the Trump administration has chosen to actually pull out of the region, people tend to cite Iraq and Afghanistan and say, well, we've been there forever. We don't need to go to Syria as well. So what made you, what about your research made you decide that that actually goes back to Mogadishu, not Iraq, Afghanistan? Because I knew a little bit about Mogadishu, and Black Hawk Down, obviously, but I didn't know that much. And this obviously precedes the Iraq War. So what made you actually tie U.S. policy decisions now to that? What in your research proved that to you?
Well, in looking at the research, I saw the trend of United States foreign involvement drop significantly after 1993 and 1994, which I was curious about. So I decided to look a little deeper into it, and I found a source I have on this slide here called The Successes and Failures of the Battle of Mogadishu and Its Effects on U.S. Foreign Policy. And it was an essay written entirely about that. It basically states that due to the Clinton administration's decision and immediate withdrawal from Somalia, that they pulled out in the United States public due to the media images, and the government's reaction became extremely casualty averse. So the United States doesn't want to get involved because it'll make their people upset. Like, interestingly enough, looking at Iraq and Afghanistan, as you mentioned, they are anomalies. Like, they are very much outliers in the research that I've found. And that is the only place, those are the only two conflicts since Mogadishu in which we have put major, heavy amounts of troops on the ground, committed large amounts of resources to anything besides air power. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. That was good. I'd never really known much about between, basically, honestly, Desert Storm and 9/11. I'd never really done much research or heard anything much between those two conflicts. I knew about Rwanda, that we didn't get involved, but I'd always kind of assumed that was just Bill Clinton kind of doing his thing and just choosing not to go. I'd never really tied it to Mogadishu, and I just thought that was interesting. I was going to ask you why we don't go to Syria, if that's connected, but you covered that. So yeah, that was good. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Cooper. That was a good answer, a good question. And I know Andrew was I think looking forward to something like that. Andrew, if you could go ahead and shut down your slideshow just so I can see everybody as they kind of make their motions to ask questions. And as he transitions away from the slideshow, I'll let someone else step in to ask a question.
Andrew, this is Dr. Nelson. I've got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Actually, two questions. First is, the first one was raised, Black Hawk Down. To what degree has that shaped our understanding of what transpired there? And then the second question is one I don't expect you to really come across, but to what degree does racism play a role in our lack of commitment in the region, given that we are talking about Africa, which traditionally, from U.S. foreign policy aspect, is we have not ventured into that region. So Black Hawk Down, the impact, and then whether you see any elements of racism shaping this event one way or another.
Okay. To answer your first question for Black Hawk Down, it's interesting because the source material that Mark Bowden used for that book was also my primary source material. He was very spot on with what he described and portrayed in that movie. As for how it's affected our view of it, I think it's glorified it a bit more than it should have been. It paints the battle as a tragic success more than almost a complete failure. But I suppose that's my opinion on it. I haven't really found much research as to how that's affected it. And for your second question about racism, I don't really know a whole lot about what's happened since Mogadishu. I know that it was a big factor in Somalia, in the Somalian theater. For example, General Harrison initially offered a $25,000 reward for any information leading to the capture or death of General Aidid. And the Somalis found this incredibly insulting. They believed that it was a statement that they were worth next to nothing to the Americans, and that it turned most of the Somali population against the United Nations and the United States, which I found very interesting in looking at. It showed a bit of overconfidence, at least at that point, on the United States' part, saying, we're a rich country, you're obviously a poor nation, we can give you a little bit, and that'll be good enough for you. But clearly it wasn't. As for since then, I don't believe the United States and the military has changed its stance fully, made a complete 180 on that. But I do think we're getting better because we do have small numbers of troops in places like Djibouti and small other nations in Africa in order to at least help out in an advisory sense.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. Others? See Dr. Vicky leaning in. Yes, he's clicked on. Okay.
As an historian, obviously, who covers especially World War II and the Holocaust, to me, it's obviously a horrific tragedy that the U.S. as a power that came into World War II to ultimately then stop the genocide, and afterwards this idea of the commitment to never again allow this to happen. There were obviously then from then on U.S. involvements that sometimes were seen as failures, as we talked about Vietnam, and then obviously Mogadishu is certainly there's no question to me that there's a direct line, as you described, between Mogadishu, the unwillingness to commit again, and the Rwandan genocide. It kind of wakes up people to say, oh my gosh, so we stood by when people were murdered. How can we do that? So at one point, as an historian, I see why people might get fed up with war, and especially never-ending wars. But then you see the plight of the people of Syria, and you say, why is the U.S. not involved? I wondered actually if you, in your research, and perhaps even in your kind of personal commitment, as you think you will be, joining the U.S. military if you are not already officially part of it. Are you concerned that soldiers are used in some ways in these potentially open-ended missions around the globe that don't really concern directly the strategic interests of the U.S., but are basically humanitarian in their attempt to kind of stop genocide? So, do you think that's worthwhile doing, especially looking at what happened in Somalia after the U.S. left, what happened in Rwanda without U.S. involvement, what happened in Syria without U.S. involvement? All of these are horrifying tragedies. But the question is, does this somehow help us make a better decision based on what we have done or haven't done? I'm not sure if there's an actual question here. I'm just struggling with this because I feel as a human being, when I see injustice, my reaction is we have to commit. On the other hand, sending you, Andrew, into a war zone, without a clear mission to try to hopefully save some people might also be completely irresponsible. I'm not sure what your opinion is on that.
In my opinion, I think personally, I would rather be involved in a humanitarian mission than to be in an open-ended conflict like Iraq and Afghanistan. Interestingly enough, in the same document that President Clinton issued, the PDD-25, that kind of gave the United States the out to say we don't want to be involved in anything. One of the criteria that was required for us to get involved in anything is a clear end date. So we are required to, if let's say we were to go to Rwanda, we would say, okay, we're here on April 15th. We have to be out by June 6th. That would have to be done and completed. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. I think that is a good way for the United States to do it, to set not to have open-ended conflicts, which is what people are very afraid of. But at the same time, it severely limits our ability to help in situations like this should we get involved. Whereas if the powers that be who are trying to commit these atrocities know the United States won't be around after this certain date, they can just wait.
That's an excellent point. Yeah. So while it's certainly better to have an exit strategy, especially an endpoint that would be much more kind of allowing troops to know what they're up against, it certainly gives also an advantage to the opposite side to kind of gauge how long do we have to lay low before they leave again, and then we can do what we want. So yeah, if you're trying to stop a genocide that way, also that is risky at best in some ways to kind of commit to a certain timetable. On the other hand, an open timetable doesn't seem to work too well either if you look at Afghanistan right now. So it's very difficult, I think, to kind of know how to handle these things. Having served in Bosnia, I know that Bosnia to this day is not entirely peaceful, and we have been there for many years, and I fear that there will be probably a commitment for many more years in some ways, or hopefully eventually that places like Bosnia will find a solution in some ways that is a permanent solution, that is a peaceful one. So having served in a conflict zone, I know how long these things take, and sometimes I'm not even sure if there is, a direct solution. On the other hand, not stopping genocide, Rwanda is even worse. And also, there seems to be only bad alternatives, in my opinion, unfortunately.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Vicky, for those thoughts and reflections. It's definitely a challenging topic to ponder, and I think started with Cooper's question of kind of what led Andrew into it. I think it's helpful to kind of see how your thoughts have unfolded on it, and certainly with someone going into the military like yourself, this is something that's going to kind of shape your outlook in terms of your own stake in the game. I think we might have time for one last question as we get ready to transition toward the last presentation. So I want to make sure I give any of you students out there a chance to ask a question if you have one. I see Armel leaning in. No, he's okay. By the way, it's the time of day where dogs have started showing up on my screen included, right? It must be they're on the same sort of program. Like it's getting close to 1 o'clock. Okay, or 2 o'clock. Any last questions? Okay, so it's 1:57. Thank you, Andrew. We'll take just a couple minute quick break before we start with Emily at 2 o'clock sharp. Hey, Emily. So you remember Bellatrix, right?
I know, I saw her earlier. Oh my gosh.
I think you're the only one maybe in the class that's actually
She's
met.
my favorite. I still have that picture with her when you brought her to class my sophomore year.
I was preparing some pictures to send to a friend of mine. I was going through all of my pictures of her in our album, and that picture came up as well when she was just a little puppy.
She's so little.
Yeah.
She got a little trim too.
She did, yeah. She about every 3 months they take her to the groomers. So how's it feel to be the last presenter of the day?
No pressure. No, I'm excited. It's a lot to follow. Everybody did so good. So
I've been very pleased with everybody so far, and so I'm sure you'll keep us consistent in that regard. Yes, Armel.
Are we gonna meet after we're done with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of informally, Armel. When Emily finishes, I'll just have a couple comments for all of you as a group. It won't be long. It won't be a formal meeting.
Okay.
Let's see here. We're close. People are coming back online. Let's see. Sarah, Armel, and Andrew, how's it feel to be on the backside of your presentations?
Feels great.
Yeah, feeling good.
I can breathe
It
now.
feels amazing.
Tezza, did you lose your coat?
Yeah, it was getting a little hot in here.
Andrew, I like the pi number that you have on the wall there.
Yeah, I'm in my 7th grade math classroom right now.
You sure that's not your bedroom? You're just not kind of a geek and
Hey, we don't need to delve too much into anyone's personal life, Dr. Nelson.
Yeah, I was interested in the hawk kite or whatever it is up there in the corner.
Yeah, my mom works at the school that I went to, so this is figured it would be a good solid idea to be in a classroom.
And your reporting officer would probably be in shock if he saw the length of your hair right now.
I know. I wish I could get a haircut.
You can go bowling in Georgia.
That's all you need.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to transition. Excuse me. I'm getting all choked up. To our last presenter of the day, and for those who are joining us live, this is the last presentation in our session titled Colonialism and its After Effects. We had Armel TeTe earlier talking about a comparison between events in Cameroon and Algeria, and so to finish us up today, we have another topic on Algeria. And as I mentioned earlier in the session, this is kind of looking at some of the philosophical dimensions related to the conflict, particularly looking at it from a metropolitan perspective as opposed to on the ground. So I'm not going to give any more away of the presentation, but at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our senior cross-country runner, Emily Swanigan.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Campbell. Okay, sorry, I got to pull this up. Figuring it out. Wait, why isn't it working? You got to share your entire screen?
Yeah.
There we go. Sorry. Can people see it?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, people are good?
Yep, and then just, there you go. Excellent.
Awesome, perfect. Okay, thank you, Dr. Campbell. I just also wanted to say everybody did a really great job. It's been really cool to see everyone's research finally come to fruition, and you all did really spectacular, have awesome topics, so congrats on being done. I hope I can finish this out well, and also thanks to Dr. Campbell for helping, I guess, all of us just go through this process, taking it from, I think, back to August when we started this, and like even just thinking about what on earth was I going to do for my capstone, and being here is really cool. So sad we can't do it live, but still glad we get to do it. And that being said, I'm presenting my senior capstone on the necessity of and the justification for anti-colonial violence in the Algerian Revolution. The Algerian Revolution, also known as the Algerian War of Independence, was historically one of the bloodiest revolutions, and it took place from 1954 to 1962. This revolution saw the northern African colony of Algeria break free from its colonial parent, France. Indeed, this specific revolution was in fact the bloodiest revolution that the French actually experienced during their decades of decolonization. Kind of put that in perspective, this War of Independence cost the lives of over 300,000 people, And that number is actually still considered to be a gross underestimation, according to a lot of different Algerian sources and reports. So regardless, this war was obviously extremely impactful during the 20th century and really influenced the course of history for these two nations as well. So this past year, the last spring, I studied abroad in Paris, France, and which is considered to be the metropole in France. And it was there that I first learned about the complex and the painful history that existed between Algeria and France. Today, actually, Algerians in Paris have a unique and often really bleak reality. They live in communities that are isolated on the outskirts of Paris. And once we began studying the Algerian Revolution during our class on violence and terror in modern history, I knew that I wanted to gain a deeper understanding on this topic. So after finishing my preliminary research, I found there were two major questions that I wanted to answer. The first, how did France fail to reconcile Algeria to itself through peaceful means in the years leading up to the Algerian Revolution? Similarly, was the Algerian militant response validated and or necessary in order to achieve political independence from France? So these two questions intend to establish a holistic view concerning the violence that defined this revolution and brought independence to a French colony, while also simultaneously leaving a stain on French history in general. My thesis, therefore, is as follows. This research seeks to understand and highlight the events that stirred Algeria to violence, while additionally arguing for the necessity of Algeria's violent anti-colonial revolution. This war of independence can ultimately be attributed to several years of French political refusal to consider proposed Algerian assimilation efforts and peaceful democratic solutions, while new approaches to decolonization were developed through key scholars such as Fanon and Sartre, both of whom I will talk about further on in this presentation. So much historical study has already been done in an attempt to understand the causation and the progression of violence throughout the Algerian Revolution. Additionally, much has also been done to analyze the perspectives and the arguments of important advocates for anti-colonial violence during this time, mainly, like I said, Frantz Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre. One important source by Valerie Orlando, the Algerian New Novel, demonstrates the unique ways in which intellectual thinkers and advocates sought to bring awareness to Algerians' plight during these years. She connects intellectual thought to the violent nature of revolution, while aligning herself with the views expressed specifically from Sartre. Peter Houdy's study on Frantz Fanon helps provide a helpful chronological perspective on how Fanon eventually entered into the conversation on the Algerian Revolution. His argument shows that Fanon was left with no choice but to support the Algerians after recognizing the hypocrisy and the inconsistencies that were present in the French government. Peter Krauss provides a unique analysis on the early nationalist movements in his book, Rebel Power, that worked to bring Algeria to independence in a peaceful way in the decades before the 1950s. His argument, however, insists that it was a failure to unify that drove the native Algerians to violence, rather than a failure from French political bodies. And finally, Marnia Leisreg searches deeper into the psychological and philosophical claims of both Frantz Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre in her book, Torture and Twilight of the Empire. She too aligns herself with the belief that violence in the revolution was justified due to its reciprocal nature. There are several other additional sources which brought insight and support to my own research. However, these four were the ones that really served to best strengthen the claims that I had. Before relaying my argument, I wanted to provide a basis of understanding on this topic with some basic background history. So as previously mentioned, and as Armel talked about earlier on, Algeria was a French colony. This conquest began in the 1830s as France worked to take control over the capital city of Algiers. Through the next few decades, French control was fully established in the region. And by the early 20th century, Algeria was viewed, for all intents and purposes, merely as an extension of France. The phrase, Algeria, it is France, was common. However, through this time, the native Algerian population experienced severe poverty, famine, and wealth inequality between themselves and the French settlers, known as colons. The few educated Algerians sought to advocate for further Algerian rights by appealing to esteemed French ideals and values, such as liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, several nationalist groups began to emerge, which would push for rights for the native Algerians. The first, the Young Algerians, did not even advocate for independence. Rather, they wanted to assimilate fully with France, thereby adopting French customs, French laws, and in effect, the rights of French citizens. The greatest attempt at assimilation can be seen through the Bloom-Violet proposal, where members of the Algerian Communist Party met with French representatives in order to receive political integration of Algeria and France, along with additional education and economic reforms. In reality, this proposal would really only bring voting rights to just over 20,000 elite Muslims. However, this plan never received full support from the French government or French settlers in Algeria, so it was never passed. The North African Star was the first group to suggest Algerian independence. They advocated for basic human rights for the Algerian. However, their pursuits were still nonviolent in nature. The Algerian People Party had similar goals while still seeking to hold peaceful and integrated relations with France. Their fate was that of the North African Star. The French government was unwilling at this point in the 1930s to address peaceful democratic solutions proposed by these educated nationalist movements. After the World Wars, in which thousands of Algerians fought and died for the French tricolor, there was an underlying expectation from Algeria, but also from the world community, that France would make reparations to Algeria. This did not happen, however. By 1943, the Friends of the Liberty Manifesto released a document denouncing the actions of the French colonizer and proclaiming Algerians' right to self-determination. Over the next decade, several other movements would come forward to plea for national sovereignty and the rights for native Algerians. With repeated political dismissal from the French, the Algerians were ripe for a violent revolution by the early 1950s, and they were finally united under the Front de Libération Nationale, which is the National Liberation Front, also known as the FLN, which would bring Algeria to independence in whatever necessary means. The FLN released their own declaration in November of 1954, stating that after decades of struggle, the national movement has reached its final stage of realization. Internally, the people are united behind this sign of independence and action. Their intents are left unquestioned as they address their declaration to the militants of the national cause, seeking the struggle by all possible means until their goal is realized. Violence, as we can see, was certainly not a first resort, but by 1954 was undoubtedly an inevitable course of action. The failure of the French, their ultimate unwillingness to diplomatically pursue change in cooperation with Algeria in those decades preceding revolution. An important figure behind the intellectual argument can be found through Frantz Fanon. Although he grew up in Martinique, which is another French colony, Fanon eventually aligns himself with the Algerian cause. He additionally served on the ground during the revolution to psychologically aid Algerian victims of French torture. Several of his most famous works illustrate the reality of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Specifically, The Wretched of the Earth, A Dying Colonialism, and Black Skin, White Masks were a few that I utilized from primary sources within this research process. In accordance with his writings, Fanon believed that violence was always an inherently reciprocal thing. Like a boomerang set into motion, the consequences of the original actions of the French colonizer had only come back in equal force through the Algerian Revolution. He states it perfectly here. Colonialism cannot be understood without the possibility of torturing, of violating, of massacring. Torture is an expression and a means of the occupant-occupied relationship. Ultimately, a violent revolution was necessary to truly break free from France and establish Algerians' own national sovereignty. Another famous thinker who aligned himself in support with Fanon was Jean-Paul Sartre. As another social commentator, Sartre was well familiarized with the situation in Algeria. He also wrote on the condition, in particular, prefacing Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. He felt extremely frustrated and disappointed with the way the French were politically choosing to turn a blind eye to pleas from the native Algerians. His frustration with France shines through in his writings. You who are so liberal, so humane, and take the love of culture as far as affection, pretend to forget that you have colonies and that people are being massacred there in your name. To such an enlightened nation, Their actions against the Algerians showed a great contradiction and hypocrisy on the part of the French. Sartre ultimately stands behind this notion that the violent Algerian was exactly what the French colonizer had created them to be. Before finishing and proceeding through the rest of my argument, I felt it was also important to mention the perspective of an advocate for peace between France and Algeria. He was persistent in this thought, even through all the years of revolution. Albert Camus was considered a Europeanized Algerian. Despite growing up in Algeria, Camus spent the years of the revolution in France, in Paris to be specific. In all his writings, he references himself as French, while repeatedly insisting that peace was possible for the two countries, even if it appeared difficult, if not impossible. Despite claiming to support the causes of the native Algerian, Camus continually insists that violence will only bring ruin to Algeria, as the French themselves had a right to exist in the same place. His perspective is not only filled with French bias, but ultimately ignorant to the true reality that Algerians were facing by the early 1950s. So after establishing that this violent revolution was necessary, the question of justification must be considered. Although I believe that we cannot create a scholarly argument for or against the morality of a violent revolution, it is still possible to consider whether this revolution was justified. Although revolution was sparked from French political dismissal of the 1930s and the 1940s, it was the racist and oppressive nature of colonialism that would ultimately justify this violent revolution. As both Fanon and Sartre argue, the French had to justify their actions in some way. Therefore, they had to consider, however consciously or subconsciously, the Algerian as a subhuman, an inferior race. We now understand this to be the definition of racism. Exploitation defines the reality of a colony. Therefore, violence must be considered a permissible course of action in the process of dismantling it. So to conclude, there's a recognition that French colonial subjugation was oppressive as well as violent. Violence began with the colonizer in the 1830s. As the French made the Algerian to be subhuman, the Algerians' pursuit of equality is what allowed violent revolution to become justifiable. As France refused to consider the many attempts made by the Algerians for either assimilation or for peaceful independence, the native Algerian was left with no choice beside violent revolution. In fact, a violent beginning could really only meet its match through a violent end. Thank you guys for listening. Anybody have any questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. Give me the claps and the snaps. And so I see some of your peers on the screen there. As I transit, there you go. Thank you so much, because that gives me a chance to see all the folks out there who are participating. And of course, I know we have people on the live stream as well who are listening into this. And now we have the opportunity to ask Emily some questions on this very good presentation. Go for it, Dr. Vicky.
Yeah, you're seeing my thoughts. So first of all, this was excellent. That's an excellent presentation, Emily. Fascinating in so many ways because you kind of give the background to this whole conflict. I was not familiar with how long this conflict actually kind of simmered and that there were these political attempts, many of them, in fact, as you showed, that were trying to peacefully resolve this. I really was only familiar with the kind of kind of violent attempt of the 50s, in which they then tried to kind of get rid of the French government or control of Algeria altogether. What I wondered, and I'm not sure if there is an easy answer, is you seem to suggest, and I think your thesis makes sense, your argument makes sense, that because the French used racism and violence in order to keep Algeria down, there really was no other way than a violent overthrow of this order, and ultimately they actually succeeded. You can actually make the case, they tried it peacefully, it didn't work, then they tried violently, and it did work. Mm-hmm. I wonder, however, if the effort of de Gaulle, and perhaps it was too little too late, when de Gaulle comes into power, he actually is one of the few people who seem to make an actual well-meaning effort, in my opinion, to really bring more of what the Algerians were probably during the peaceful period still asking for with his peace plan of economic progress in Algeria, and also including not just the French-born or French-originated colonists who kind of live in the northern part, but everyone in Algeria, to give them a fair shake, to give them part of this greater economic progress, more education, more infrastructure, more everything. It seemed to me that when de Gaulle came in, he really was well-meaning in kind of trying to peacefully settle this. And ultimately, the FLN didn't go there. They actually continued with the violence. I wonder if they passed a chance here to actually divert from this violent path and potentially create a peaceful solution at that moment, or if your sources kind of indicated that there was never a chance after the 40s were over, after the war, because the French didn't take the earlier chances. It was simply too late. Would you say that de Gaulle simply didn't have a chance because it came too late, or because the FLN was not willing to entertain any kind of peaceful solution other than complete victory in some way?
I think it's a little bit of both. Honestly, I think the research that I've done has indicated both of those things. De Gaulle's a really interesting president because, and a lot of this actually is in my paper talking about French opinion in understanding the Algerian War. And I think that there was a belief, obviously, when he came into power that, okay, he was going to turn things around in Algeria. He was going to take care of things. Because at that point, by you get to 59, majority of France was done. They wanted out of the war. They didn't want to continue putting their money into, obviously, feeding into another, anti-colonial, whatever, violent revolution. But I think part of it was de Gaulle had to save face. I think France had gotten into this. And I think, after we heard from Armel, like losing Cameroon, all these other things were going on at the same time. It was kind of one of those things that Algeria had been such a stronghold, and it was so important to France and like the French colonial empire that it was, I think, one of those things that despite probably his best intentions, it might have been a little too late. But I also think on the same hand that, when looking at this research, by the time the FLN picked up and really got started, and by the time the French started torturing the Algerians the way they did, the Algerians were fully committed. They were not playing a game anymore of, okay, well, we'll compromise with France. They wanted what they wanted. They wanted Algeria, and they wanted their rights. They wanted to be able to have a Muslim state that was a free, independent, that they could vote. And so I think, I definitely think it's a little bit of both. But I think de Gaulle, despite his best intentions, I think by the time he came in, the France was already into the position where they had to finish kind of what they started.
So you didn't find on the side either of some people in Algeria back then, or perhaps even today, people who also would have embraced Camus' idea of like, let's find a peaceful solution. There must be a peaceful solution. You kind of said, he didn't see the reality. He didn't see the reality of the time. I wondered if some people did subscribe to this idealist version, or perhaps even today kind of think back like we could have changed it. Who knows? Was in the late 50s the majority already entitled course of violence, or is it really only almost after the fact, after they win and the French withdraw, that then people say, oh, it worked. Obviously now, we're all for the solution because it got us what we wanted. Not sure if that could be, there probably were no opinion polls at the time, so it's probably difficult to answer that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that by the time you get to 54 and you see that the FLN comes in, from there, I think that if there were people pushing for peace, like Camus, for example, although he was Algerian, he was Europeanized, right? So he was of European descent, and he didn't actually even spend any time during the revolution in Algeria. And so I think there was a whole lot of frustration with stuff that was coming out of Algeria, also to the French, where all these reports were, they dumbed down what was actually happening. And I think that was just continually frustrating for the Algerians to the point where it was like, what the French and what the world is being told is not actually maybe what's happening on the ground in terms of the violence, what's happening, how we're being treated, and all these stories of torture, like we talked about in class, Henry Alleg, and just his experience. Once those stories got out to the French public, I think that was huge in changing the dynamic of it, where the world was like, wow, this is actually happening. This is actually really violent and awful what's happening to the Algerians. I'm not sure if that answers that question, but
it does. Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah. It's just frustrating. Again, you know, as a historian, I'm always frustrated with, you know, so you want the world to work a certain way, and I'm always like, oh, Gandhi, you know, he's amazing. Non-violence, that's the course of action. You know, that's how you take down an empire. And then FLN is like, forget the non-violence. You know, let's bomb the hell out of them, and ultimately they end up actually successful. Ultimately, actually proving that yes, you can actually embrace violence and still win. Which is unfortunate in my opinion, but you know, it's a tough. I rather would have Camus, you know, come in and, you know, provide an idealistic solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vicky, for that question. I'm gonna step in and ask you a question, just because if I don't, I'll forget it. So Emily, this topic and your approach very much informed by your experiences abroad, and you mentioned at the onset of your presentation, you know, witnessing kind of the conditions of Native Algerians living in Paris today. And so you had a chance to kind of contemplate this issue from the perspective of being in the metropole. And when Wretched of the Earth is written by Fanon, and of course he dies before it's published in 1961. And as you mentioned, also Jean-Paul Sartre is the one who writes the preface for it. And in the preface, what Sartre says is, this book, you know, it's not for you. Okay, he's speaking to a European and American readership included, right? He said, this is not written for you, but it's written about you, and you would do well to listen. And so my question is, with that in mind, what is the value of looking at a topic, right? Because you kind of flip it, because we typically maybe look at the Algerian Revolution from a ground level, right? In country level in Algeria, in the colony itself, and looking at the FLN. But you've taken this kind of detached perspective of looking at it from the metropole. And so my question simply is, what have you found to be the value of that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think I knew when we got into this and I got into this topic that I wanted to have a perspective that incorporated the metropole. I took a class called Multicultural France when I was in Paris, and we spent a lot of time talking about what happens after World War II. There was a huge labor need in France, and so you see a massive immigration to France, and a lot of that was from Algeria. And I think it's just very interesting, because there was the Paris that I got to see, and I lived in the middle of the city, you know, like a couple blocks from Notre Dame, and that's the Paris the world knows. And then you get on the metro and you go, you know, 20 minutes north, and you get off in a stop and you're in les banlieues, which is neighborhoods. And that is where all the Algerians live, and that's where conditions are a lot worse. There's people, families in these tiny apartments just stacked. And there's just an understanding and a realization that I had when I was in Paris of there's a whole lot more to consider when it comes to like race, and when it comes to, okay, let's look at the situation here, where I guess that was the first time really realizing you know, how do I justify violence? Because personally, I wouldn't, you know, this was hard for me because I was like, I don't necessarily agree with violence. I don't agree that their tactics were the best, but I'm a white American woman, and I've never been persecuted for my race, and I've never been persecuted for what I believe, and I've never had to deal with colonial oppression. And so I think the value in reading stuff like Fanon and Sartre and challenging yourself is, it's not easy, but the point of it is to develop us, right? If the goal of humanity is to become better people, and if we're going to better build our future, that's the whole point of history. Everything that happens today is based off of yesterday. And so I think that for me, that's where the value comes in, is you have to be willing to say, this is going to be uncomfortable and it's going to hurt, but it's going to develop me as a person so that I can better help people and better make this world, I guess, what it needs to be. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Others?
I have a question for you, Emily. I was just wondering, I know that you're very interested in the developing world, and so I was wondering if that impacted your research in any way.
Yeah, it did. So originally I wanted to do something, because when I was in France, I had an opportunity to work with women who had been trafficked from Nigeria to France. And so that was kind of that drove my international studies capstone. And I wanted to connect that in here, but it was a little bit better, the ties between Algeria and France. And I think the thing that drove what I wanted to do for Capstone and why I'm thankful for this class was I've been so interested in history and the period of colonialism and looking at how that fell apart and why that fell apart. And I just think it's important that we don't ever forget that. And for me, when I look at all the things, that are wrong in the world, like we're in policies of developing world right now with Lance, we talk about all these theories. Why is this like this? Why is this poverty this bad in this country? And for me, a lot of it I could trace back to, well, they were colonies and they were basically taken advantage of. And like I said, exploitation defines the reality of a colony. And for me, that's something that's really important is I love that historical aspect and wanting to be able to not forget that and to promote countries and people who haven't had their stories told and their history told the way that it should be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Dr. Nelson, I think I see you waiting in the wings. I can't see you.
Well, I was going to follow up. It was going back to what Dr. Vicky stated in kind of this idealistic Gandhi approach and gaining the independence through nonviolence and just kind of making, not necessarily a question, but kind of, I'll throw it out there for you to respond just as a statement, but to what degree did, the United States was able to grant the Philippines their independence, the British were able to grant the Indians their independence in part because their prestige in the world was not questioned. But during World War II, France collapsed. And so many have argued that their attempts to hang on to Vietnam, they were forced to do that as a way of proving their place among the world powers. And obviously, after you have the defeat in Southeast Asia, it's almost as if more credibility is on the line in resisting these rebellions in Africa. And I just didn't know I don't know if there's much to comment about that, but just how the French war experience is so much different than what you have with the British and the Americans, which allow them to pursue more of a anti-colonialism track, whereas the French try to hang on.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's so. I put that in my research and thought about that the whole time that I was working through this. Is ultimately, France. When you look at it, like, okay, yeah, Second World War, technically they won, but they were, absolutely ruined, basically the country, and they were struggling. And De Gaulle was huge in rebuilding that, but at the same time, it's exactly like you said, right? Their empire, it was crumbling, and I think the French did this unique thing where they, like I was talking about, justified everything through the means of their values, and so they had to make it okay. Well, we have these colonies, we have people, but and this was true with all colonies, but I think especially the French did this of like, well, we're going to better them. We're going to educate and we're going to promote these values because we're the French. And like, if we're the people of the revolution, the Enlightenment started with us. And I think that reputation, the world knew it. France knew the world knew it. And so, by the time the 1940s and the 50s are rolling around, they're seeing these things of, wait a second, maybe we can't actually justify having colonies, but how can we afford to lose them? Not only for economic sake, but for political, for reputation in the world. And like you said, being a world power. And I definitely think that had a massive impact in why the French probably in those early nationalist movements as well were unwilling to, do a diplomatic solution. I think that they really believed they could hold on to Algeria because, like I said, this belief, Algeria, it is France. It was their mantra. And technically there were a lot of French settlers in Algeria. And so there was deep French, entrenchment, and it had been in Algeria for, over a century. And so it really felt like it was France. And I definitely think that's why they held on as long as they did and why it was so hard to just be unwilling to say, you know what, yeah, you deserve independence, you deserve your rights. So.
Yeah, thanks.
was a very good
Okay.
answer to a very interesting question. Sorry, I know we are out of time.
No, it's, hey, listen.
Thing. Okay.
What I was going to say is that this is obviously a good presentation because it's garnered such a good question. So, Dr. Vicky, I would never cut you off, please.
Oh no, thank you. Just two short points. One is I thought this was really interesting that Dr. Nelson brought this up about this kind of putting it into the context of World War II. In fact, I think this argument could be taken even further back because if you remember, I'm not sure, the beginnings of French colonialism lie actually in the defeat against the Prussians in the war in 1871 when the Germans kind of overrun them and then found their empire in Versailles. And after this horrifying experience, the German government encourages the French to, oh yeah, why don't you just, focus on the colonialism, and make your nation great by focusing on that. So in some ways, they set them up on this path of defining themselves as great because of the colonies they have. And then, losing in World War II certainly made this argument, just as convincing, if not even more convincing, to hold on no matter what the cost, which is very different from the British. The one thing I came across, and I'm not sure if you saw the movie, is the movie Cache or Caché, Hidden. I will actually post it here on our chat, so that you, if you haven't seen it, this is a movie from 2005. It's about this very educated, very liberal French couple living in Paris, and they're always all of a sudden confronted with a past dark history of this young man or boy at the time having a Algerian in origin and is kind of sent away, and kind of how racism kind of underlies French society, and all of a sudden comes out in these violent ways, even though they all believe themselves to be humanitarian and not racist at all. Ultimately, they're confronted with this dark past of this main character, and how he kind of just forgot about this boy who grew up with him. If you haven't seen it, I think it fits right into this idea of what happens when people who were colonized now living in Paris and are still treated in differently and discriminatorily in racist ways, even though no one admits to that racism. I thought the movie was brilliant and kind of bring this out because it's certainly hidden because no one talks about it.
Just like a comment on that to verify what you're saying, when I was at university in Paris, we had to go through a security check every time we would go into the building for the university. And at first, it was like the first month you had to open your backpack, you had to show it to the guards, and you had to show your ID. And by the time it was March, I started realizing that the only people who had to open their backpack, who had to show their IDs, and were stopped by the security guards were either people who were African American or from Asian descent. There weren't anyone who was white, seemed European. And it was something where I was like, I never got an opportunity to ask the French, but I had a lot of opportunity to talk with different people that I was studying with about it. And we got to understand and realize that racism actually is still really embedded in French more than I ever really realized. It's very much there. So.
Yeah, very, very good point, Dr. Vicky. Did you have any follow-up to what Emily said?
No, I thought it was extremely good. Thank you.
Okay, and I do want to give a quick disclaimer and warning. Dr. Vicky is an expert on all sorts of interesting films. He recommended one time. I watched White Ribbon with him one time. It left me traumatized. So I fully expect if you watch Cash, you will be similarly traumatized. So just be mindful of that.
Disclaimer: yes, you would be traumatized because there's one super shocking scene that you do not expect, and all of a sudden it happens, and you're like, "Oh my gosh!" And so when you watch it, like strap yourself in. Don't drink any hot beverages.
I have a quick question.
Okay, Armel, take us to the.
I have a question about the argument about between Fanon and Sartre that the French had to justify the action in Algeria. Do you think that that might be some of the reason why the French didn't have enough answer to the action in Algeria, so that they had to pull out from the Algeria a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that was part of it in terms of having to basically, I think the French realized, I think, most colonial powers realized, like, once things started to be revealed to them, unfolded, of how the colonies were happening. Kind of what Sartre said, like, you have colonies and people are being massacred there in your name. And that didn't just apply to the French government, that applied to everyone who was a French citizen to wake up and to understand and to recognize what was going on. And so I definitely think that their justification had to come from, well, you know, and I think that's what started slavery, right? Was, well, these people aren't human, they're animals. So that's why we can justify doing everything we're doing. And so I think, you know, you can trace that thought through to colonies of, well, yeah, well, these native Algerians, these Muslims, they don't have the refined, you know, culture, they don't have the refined laws or the ability to really be on our level. So they're not really human, they're subhuman. And so I think that that's, and, you know, Fanon talks a lot about that, and especially in the regards of race, he really looks at that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Armel, for that question. Thank you, Emily. So by way of conclusion, first I want to say great job, Emily. It's a good way for us to end today. So excellent presentation. To all the people out there in cyberspace watching it live, thank you for joining us today. Your participation and interest is very well appreciated. Dr. Vicky and Dr. Nelson, you guys both asked some excellent questions today, and gave some good recommendations to Dr. Vicky. So thank you for the questions and for being here and being engaged. And all those who who presented or didn't present in this last session, all you guys have come up with some good questions, which helps to certainly keep these things fresh. One thing I'll mention also is, you know, Honors Day, and when we do these capstone presentations, when we're in the auditorium, all of you guys, you've been working on this for a while, and typically you end the day feeling, you know, somewhat worn out, somewhat tired. It's a different kind of experience for me today, and I don't know, I think it's probably the caliber and the high quality of the presentations, but I'm not feeling tired after watching these for, you know, 4 out of the last 6 hours. I'm actually feeling quite invigorated. So I want to compliment all of you for what I found were across the board very engaging, very eloquent presentations with very interesting topics. So definitely applaud each of you individually for your efforts. We're in strange and unusual times, and I think sometimes when these type of things happen, we maybe kind of concentrate our efforts and energies in creative and in kind of unpredictable ways. And so I think I don't know, it's you guys have really risen to the occasion despite what would otherwise be assumed to be not the best kind of conditions for this. So I don't really think you missed a beat. If anything, I think these were some of the best presentations I've seen collectively in a long time. So so I do applaud each and every one of you for that. And so it's been a pleasure. Dr. Vicky and Dr. Nelson, I'm just going to finish up a couple things with my students. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and the live feed. And I think I'll be talking to you gentlemen in some other capacity sometime soon. So thank you.
All right. Congrats, everybody. You should all feel proud to have achieved such great heights today. So go out and celebrate. Well, actually, don't go anywhere. Go into your kitchen. And
don't go out and celebrate.
Go out and celebrate for yourself.
No, but I think as Dr. Campbell said very eloquently, you guys did an amazing job today. I'm very impressed. It's also just so heartwarming to see you all again. Like, it is really difficult for us as teachers too to not be in the classroom, you know, and see you on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, if you're anything like us, then yeah, this is a great opportunity for us to, I think, connect. And it was really fascinating to hear your research and to share this with us. So thank you very much for that. And I think I also greatly appreciated this live version, you know, that we actually got to talk to each other rather than just hear, you know, some form of a presentation. We weren't initially sure what format to best choose, but I think this ended up being by far superior, actually, in terms of an idea of doing the live stream. So thank you for that.
Okay. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Vicky and Dr. Nelson, for those, and particularly for those nice words. One moment.